Hey Flock, Mike here from Epic Duck Studios, and welcome to the Epic Hobby. Today I'm going to be painting Captain Marvel from Marvel Crisis Protocol by Atomic Mass Games. This video is dedicated to my patron, Chris McClure. Thank you so much, Chris, for your support. If you're interested in supporting the show yourself, you can learn more at patreon.com/epicduck. Now, Captain Marvel shares very much the same palette as Captain America. They both are predominantly blue and red, and I'll be using the exact same shades of blue and red that I used in the Captain America video. The difference is, where Captain America has a lot of white embellishment, Captain Marvel uses gold embellishment instead. So that's really going to be the key difference here between painting the two figures. I'll be using Calidor Sky as the base coat for the blue, and Techless Blue for the highlights. I'll also be using P3 Mora White to just add an additional highlight on top of the Techless Blue. For the reds, I'll be building them up with Mephiston Red and Evil Sun Scarlet. Gold parts of the costume are going to be base coat with Scrag Brown, then followed up with Averland Sunset, Flash Gets Yellow, and a little bit of P3 Mora White as well. For skin tones, we'll be base coating with Cadian Flesh Tone, and then bringing in Kislev Flesh for a highlight. Again, there might be a little bit of white on top of that. For the base, I'll be using Mechanicus Standard Gray for the pavement, and mixing that with some Administratum Gray for the sidewalk. Finally, I'll be using De La Rowney FW Black Ink for the comic book lining at the end. So to get Captain Marvel started, I'm just going to lay out all my base coats, and here I'm starting with the Calidor Sky for the blue parts. Now if you're used to traditional miniature painting where you start with a base coat and then you add a mid-tone and then add a highlight, this is about where the mid-tone would be, and the reason for that is I'm going to be adding a fair amount of black later on, specifically black lining, but also just some deep heavy shadows in a few areas, and that really brings down the overall tone of the model, so we want to start everything from a brighter standpoint than we normally would in, like I say, a more traditional sort of form of miniature painting. So now I'm on to the Mephiston Red, and I'm going to start by applying this to the armored sections of Captain Marvel's boots. As with the blue, this is a little bit brighter than you would normally start a base coat. Normally I would start with Corn Red and use Mephiston Red as the first highlight, but again I'm going to be bringing in a lot of black around this, and so to make the overall result kind of feel the same, we need to start just a little bit brighter. Aside from Captain Marvel's boots, there's also her sash, which starts at the waist and then turns into those two long flowy bits just kind of coming off her left side. The sort of upper part of her costume around the shoulders and neck, and then of course her fists. Now I'm going to start on the gold parts using Scrag Brown as the base coat. Now this color doesn't do a lot on this model. There's a little emblem on her sash that gets covered with this, and then of course the sort of area between the blue and the red on her actual clothing. When you're doing the stripe across her shoulders, don't forget the star in the middle. Now, Captain Marvel's blonde hair is going to be very, very close in tone to the gold on her clothing when I'm done. So I'm actually going to go ahead and base coat her hair now with Scrag Brown and just basically follow the same steps for the hair that I am for the clothing. So now I'm going to work on Captain Marvel's face. I'm going to use Cadian Flesh Tone for most of her skin, Rhinox Hide to basically frame the eyes in, and Fenrisian Gray for the eyes themselves. When I'm painting very small eyes, I like to paint the pupil as a straight line going through each eye, and this helps make sure that the pupils are going to be the same width and looking in the same direction. So you get a little bit out of a weird sort of like clown makeup look initially while you're working on them. What I'll then do though is then bring in this darker color. In this case, this is the Rhinox Hide, and I'll use it to frame in the shape of the eye, sort of outline a bit of like an almond shape for each eye, and then I'll work the skin tone up to that, leaving just a very, very thin line around the eye. Now, in the short term, this process is going to look really ugly. You're going to end up with sort of a raccoon mask around the character's eyes. You want to make sure that mask is fairly complete, though. You want to make sure that it actually covers, the top of the nose, right into the corners of the eye, and of course, underneath the brow ridge. You want to make sure there isn't, any obvious either primer or other base coat kind of left behind, and that the eyes both are pretty symmetrical and look in the same direction. So now I'm just checking that the eyes are roughly the same size and looking the same direction, and I think we've got it. Certainly the raccoon mask is a little bit ugly, but it's temporary. So now I'm bringing in Cadian flesh tone, and I'm just starting up on the forehead, bringing in a just normal base coat there. But what I'm going to do is start to bring that down lower and lower so it kind of rolls around the brow ridge and starts to finally frame in that almond shape of the eye, leaving just a little tiny line of Rhinox hide around the eye itself. Alright, Captain Marvel may have just a little bit too much eyeshadow on, but otherwise the eyes are symmetrical, well defined, and look fairly comic-ish, so I think mission accomplished on those. It's time to move on to highlighting the blues using the Citadel Teclis Blue. Now, Teclis Blue isn't a whole lot brighter than Calidor Sky, so you might even want to mix in a little bit of white here just to get a little more punch out of your highlight, or you'll just find you'll have to do maybe 2 passes to really get just a vibrant light blue out of this. My aim here is to create sort of a non-directional highlight, so I'm basically looking at the model from every angle and painting the areas that are more or less facing upwards. So I'm trying to hit maybe 50% of the model with this highlight, and then there'll be an opposing shadow basically everywhere this highlight doesn't hit. So the opposite side of this leg, for example, might receive a dark shadow that complements the highlight I'm creating. Now, the beautiful thing about comic style is we don't care if there's blends or smooth transitions between our base coats and our highlights. It's perfectly acceptable to have a very sharp color break, just a transition bang right from one to the next, because that's very common in comic books as well as cartoons. Next up, I'm going to go ahead and highlight the gold with Averlyn Sunset. This is actually a pretty straightforward step. The sort of gold trim on her costume is basically just 2 parallel lines that just wrap all the way around with a little star in the middle. So it's actually pretty straightforward. You just follow the lines and brighten the star up. That's really all there is to this step. And there's also the little medallion on her sash. Can't forget that. Now, you probably saw this coming, but we're going to go ahead and highlight the reds with Evil Sun Scarlet. There's a lot of wrinkles and folds to the sash, and it's actually a pretty dynamic piece, especially with the long flowing bit just kind of, floating around in the air around her. So it can be a little bit challenging deciding where to place these highlights. What I recommend is just look at the model from the top down and see what surfaces are really readily visible and pick those out. And then if you feel it's not bright enough, you can just kind of expand those areas. Now, I didn't capture a good angle of it on camera, so you don't see it here, but it's worth noting that Captain Marvel's costume has a very high collar as well, so it's worth making sure you get a highlight towards the top of that just to help give it a little bit of definition. Next, I'm going to take some P3 Mora White and mix it into the Techless Blue to make an even lighter blue, which I'm going to use now for an additional series of highlights. So this highlight is really tightly focused and doesn't cover a lot of surface area. Like you can see on the leg here, it's basically just a line. There's little more to it than that. And that's really going to be the case all the way around the model. It's just a very sharp spot highlight just to give, you know, an extra little boost of color and contrast and making the model a little bit easier to read at tabletop distances. One thing we probably lose a lot when we're painting is we're always looking at our models from, 6, 8, 10 inches away. And that's not how we play with our models. We play with our models from across the table. And, how they look right in front of your face isn't necessarily how they're going to look on the gaming table. So it's important to get those extra highlights in, even though you may not think they're necessary. Now I've mixed a little bit of Mora White into the Evil Sunz Scarlet just to make a red highlight, and I'm just following the same procedure I did with the blue, just, adding that final little sharp highlight to basically every red surface. Most of that is going to be on the sash kind of flowing off of her waist. So now I'm adding highlights to the yellow parts of her costume, and I'm going to be using just straight P3 Mora White for this, putting on just very small white highlights. Once I'm done that, I'm going to come in with a thin coat of Citadel Flash Gits Yellow and just glaze over it, just to make it a really punchy bright yellow. I find Flash Gits on its own can be a little bit hard to work with because it's so translucent, but when you layer it over some white, it really makes the color shine. So here you can see pretty quickly what adding the Flash Gits Yellow over the white does. It goes from being a pretty sort of washed out looking sort of yellow where we've got, that mustard sort of base coat, then a white highlight, and it immediately just makes it a bright, shiny yellow. And that's absolutely what we want in a superhero costume. Now I'm bringing Averland Sunset back out, this time to add some highlights to her hair. So now using Citadel Kislev Flesh, I'm going to bring some highlights to her face, basically the forehead, the nose, the cheeks, and a little bit of her jawline as well. And of course the earlobes. I'm not worried about highlighting her lip because I'm going to come in with some Screamer Pink after and give her just a little hint of makeup. Now, lips typically are just darker than surrounding flesh anyway, so even if you wanted to go with a nude look or have her have no makeup on, you still don't really want to highlight it the same as the rest of the face. You want to treat it differently, so even bringing in a bit of a brown tone or something would work as well. But in this case, I'm just going to actually use some lipstick colors by using some Screamer Pink and then lightening that up a little bit. And I'll be doing that shortly. And here's the aforementioned Screamer Pink. This is going to be just her bottom lip. When you're painting miniature faces, it makes sense to ignore the top lip for the most part, because it is such a very, very thin detail that it's almost not noticeable in a miniature, and if you try to paint it, you end up making the lips look way too big. So if you just grab the bottom lip, it's often enough to really sell the look of what you're trying to accomplish with face color. I'm going to push the hair highlights a little bit further. I mixed a little bit of Mora White into Averland Sunset, and I'm just, again, just adding a little more highlight to the hair, make it even more vibrant. Actually really trying to get it close to the colors of the gold trim on her clothing. Here I decided to add a little bit more of a highlight to a few points on her face, so I mixed a little Mora White into the Kislev Flesh, and I'm basically just grabbing her eyebrows, the tip of her nose, and a little bit of her cheek there. Alright, now we're on to the bread and butter of comic style, which is of course using black ink to make this look like it's lifted from a comic book, make it look like it's a hand-drawn element. Now of course, if you don't want to do the extra work, you've got a fully painted, highlighted, really good looking model as it is, And you don't have to do this. This is just an extra step that makes it have that extra punch, makes it really look like an illustration. So there's a couple different steps I kind of try to break down the comic process into, and the first one here is just outlining details. So basically wherever there's an obvious break in a detail, whether it's where two different details meet, like the red parts of her boots and her blue leotard, or where two sort of different red panels kind of bump into each other and have a little crease, I go around and just add a deep black line to make it very clear that, you know, a line would be drawn there if it were a comic. So here, for example, I'm adding a black line underneath her sash, and then, you know, around the little medallion kind of holding the sash in place and so on. Just taking every single detail that's of consequence, not like small little surface level details, but, you know, the bigger parts, you know, the sash, the boots, the legs, the fists, and just making sure there's a black line that illustrates the fact that it's a distinct component of the model. That's kind of step one. Now I do kind of bounce around a little bit. As much as I call it step one, I sort of just work on what's in front of me as I'm looking at parts, and I like to kind of move around the model as I go. So you'll see there's areas here where I'm adding little black lines, for example, to isolate. There's kind of two gold stripes there, and I'll bring a line in between them. And that's what I would call a surface level detail. It kind of happens on the inside of a detail as opposed to separate two details, but I'm right there already making the line, so I might as well. Here, for example, I'm adding a little bit of a deep black shadow underneath her chin, and that's because that is how it would be drawn in a comic. There'd be sort of a nice deep black line there, or a black shadow, to kind of give some depth to her chin and help separate, you know, her jawline from her neck, for example. Now here I'm also adding a small black line to the back of her ear, and that is so that it's very obviously distinct from her hair, because the tone values of the skin and the hair are very, very similar, especially when viewed from a tabletop distance. The little black line really helps, you know, isolate the ear as a visual component of her face. Same thing here with the lip. I'm trying to get one line underneath the lip and a very tiny little just underline of the nose, kind of just painting the bottom side of the nose, and that's it. That's all you really need, especially on a female face. You don't want the nose to look large. You don't want it to really protrude too much. Just a tiny little dot of black on the bottom of the nose is plenty. So now I'm getting into more of the surface level detail here. She's got these little sort of knee pads, and they're not really that distinct from the rest of her clothing. You honestly could not even notice them and be forgiven for that. Her clothing also has some ribbing, kind of like running right up through the middle of the chest, and then, you know, you can see it here, kind of curves up and around her hip. And it's a very noticeable little protuberance in the, you know, the build of her costume. And I want to just draw a little bit of attention to it, so I'm adding a very, very fine black line to either side of that little raised detail. And just, again, working my way around the models. This is kind of what I would call step two, where I've already blocked out all the individual parts of the model, and now I'm kind of working on those interior details. You know, the part that's been highlighted, but it's still sort of embedded within, you know, it's a blue detail on a blue background, right, in this case. So it's a little less noticeable, and it doesn't need as heavy a line as compared to the, you know, the line that would separate the sash from the blue parts of the costume, where you want it very, very obviously distinct. This is something that's a little more subtle. There's a couple things to note. There's a few places where I purposely don't add lines. One is between her hair and her skin, and the reason for that is that it's a pretty smooth, natural transition. Hair tends to be a little bit translucent because, of course, it builds volume as you get deeper into it. And there really shouldn't be a thick black line, especially when you're looking at blonde hair against Caucasian skin. There's no real variance. There's no real just immediate jump in color value. There is a little bit of a transition that happens even at, you know, human proportions. And a black line there would just look very, very strange. If you could pull off a very thin line, it would probably be suitable. But honestly, you're just better off kind of not lining a detail like that. It makes the hair look a little bit lighter and sort of flowier in that way too, because it doesn't have that sort of weight that a black line gives it. So I'm getting further and further into the process here. I've outlined at least every detail at its kind of like basic level. You know, now I'm still working on smaller details like separating her fingers and so on. But every bit of trim, every major fold kind of already has a black line at this point. And you can already really start to see how much more distinct that makes the model look as opposed to a few minutes ago in this video. If you just wanted to rewind 5 minutes or so, you'll see basically all the colors in place. but everything looks a lot more muted. The black adds a huge amount of contrast and really makes the other colors stand out even more, because they are now, instead of being juxtaposed against, you know, a mid-tone red and a mid-tone blue, they're now standing out against black. So now here I'm getting into what's basically the third step of the black lining, and that is sort of adding large block shadows to areas. And then what I do is I focus these on the underside of details. So the bottom of the arm, the bottom of the sash, the bottom of the leg are the basic areas I'd be hitting on this model. Now Carol Danvers is actually in a very wide open, sort of approachable pose, and it doesn't actually produce a lot of deep shadowed areas. When you look at models like Captain America, where he's kind of a little bit hunched up and part of him is blocked by his shield, there's a lot more opportunity for big black areas there, whereas Carol just doesn't really have that going on. So the areas I'll be focusing on are obviously the underside of the sashes, the underside of each arm and each fist, and then just the area sort of on the inside of her left leg and sort of the inside and the underside of her right leg. And that's really about it. You know, it's a much more subdued effect on this model, because just the pose is so wide and open, and she does have, you know, more slender limbs than Captain America does, for example. But the basic idea is that when you look at a comic book, usually when there's two details that are sort of visually overlapping, like for example the left leg is straight and the right leg is kind of bent at an angle like that, where the two details kind of overlap, usually the one in the back has a sort of a black, you know, shadow cast onto it, or, you know, even just from the environment. And what that does is it allows the detail in front to kind of stand out. It's a way a comic artist, you know, uses light and shadow to just make details more evident, make them stand out better in a scene where they may actually kind of blend into each other a little bit more. And we can use that in comic style painting to our advantage as well. The other thing it does is it lets the model have outlines when viewed from certain angles. So if you have a, you know, a deep black on the underside of Carol's leg, for example, when you view that leg in profile, it looks like the bottom of the leg is outlined in place. And the more of those we can create, the more sort of in-place outlines we can generate on a model, the more it looks like the whole model has actually got an outline, even though it doesn't. It's sort of a little trick of the brain where, because we've created all these inner details that have line work, when we can create a couple lines sort of around the outer details, the human mind is used to looking at cartoons and illustration and kind of thinks it is. So this angle right here is a perfect example of that. We've got a deep underline under her right leg and under her right arm as well. And when you combine that with the lines sort of, you know, in the right elbow area where the arm is folded and so on, it creates the illusion of black line all the way around her arm, her leg, even though they're not really there. And again, here you see, you know, the line underneath each arm really in profile makes it look like they're drawn in place. Alright, that is Captain Marvel Carol Danvers, completed now in comic style. I really hope you've enjoyed this video and try this process on your own Marvel Crisis Protocol miniatures. Hey, thanks for watching my video. If you enjoyed that one, please hit like and subscribe, and don't forget to hit the bell icon so you get notifications when I post new content in the future. If you want to take your support even further, you can do so at patreon.com/epicduck. Every little bit helps me keep the lights on and the paint flowing, puts new models on the table so I can make interesting videos, and most importantly, keeps a roof over my family's head and food on the table. Honestly, Patreon is what makes doing this every single day possible. You can also catch me 6 times a week at twitch.tv/epicduckstudios. I'd really love it if you came by to watch my show sometime and clicked follow. A big thank you to everyone who has supported my stuff, both past and present, over the years. It's been a wild ride, and I couldn't do this without the fans and all of the wonderful flockers out there. The hobby community is just an amazing group of people, and you make this worth doing. So let's keep doing this together for years to come. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, do something epic.